Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. A little housekeeping first. Yes, I've gotten your personal messages informing me that many of you have been trying to send a Cash App within the last 24 hours, but instead you got a message that the transaction failed. For those of you who have wondered if I knew about it, had I gotten your messages, the answer is yes. The reason I hadn't responded is because I wanted to confirm if, first of all, this was happening, and if so, what's the cause? Well, it turns out the problem, predictably, is on Cash App's side, no surprise. After a lengthy process of communicating with their support team, who are mostly bots, I've been given the impression that the issue should be sorted by now. We'll keep our fingers crossed. All right, and now to the subject of this morning's briefing. And given the subject matter, I think it best to keep this morning's briefing brief. Everyone's been watching the steady drive towards the outbreak of hostility that we're seeing in the Middle East. I say outbreak of hostility because it was one side who chose this. You can't really say hostilities because that would be plural. Now, I've been telling you for several months now, Benjamin Netanyahu wants the war in Gaza to become a regional war. He needs it to become a regional war because prior to October 7th, he was the biggest story in Israel, and not for a good reason. In a very real sense, with their attack on October 7th, Hamas saved Benjamin Netanyahu, because just 24 hours earlier, on October 6th, the biggest story in Israel was Benjamin Netanyahu's corruption trial, and of course the pending protest over his attempts to neutralize the Israeli Supreme Court. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu and his boys, they didn't need to go hog wild against Gaza like they did, but Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to do that because he was desperate to try to get the public behind him. All those people who were in the streets by the hundreds of thousands protesting him, he was trying to find a way to consolidate their support behind him. And if there's one thing that all of Israeli society can agree on, it's that they don't like the Palestinians. He knew that, so as far as he was concerned, let's go ahead and just blow the place up. Let's make a big doggone mess out of it. And that will get me support, which it did. The higher the body count for the Palestinians gets, the more devastation that Benjamin Netanyahu has wreaked on Gaza, the higher his public approval rating has gone, although it has basically tapered off at this point. But nonetheless, he's in a better position now than he was in on October 6th, and for him, that's what really matters. But in the process of trying to quell any sort of opposition at home, he's bought himself even worse problems abroad. Because international condemnation has been the result of the war in Gaza, and Netanyahu's regime is so unpopular now internationally to the point that Israel's finally been investigated for genocide, and the ICC is pursuing the issue of arrest warrants against Netanyahu. When that occurred, the die was cast. It was bad enough before when Netanyahu was merely trying to stall for time to deal with his domestic detractors. He was hoping for a 2-year war in Gaza. He wanted at least 2 years because he figured that hopefully somewhere between 18 months and 2 years, he and his guys could get the prosecutors in Israel to forget about him, or they could buy time until his party could craft some legislation in the Knesset to get him off the hook. But now that this issue's gone international, the Knesset can't get rid of this for him. He's not going to be able to handle this behind closed doors in Tel Aviv. Now Netanyahu has a real problem. People who don't like him, who actually have the ability to do something about him if they can organize themselves. Prior to the ICJ investigation, Netanyahu's hope was for several months to stall until hopefully the Israeli people forgot, or the subject changed, or they got bored with him. But with South Africa bringing a case against Israel for genocide, the equation has changed. Netanyahu's gone from hope to now just launching any crackpot scheme he can to try to bring up some noise, anything to keep himself away from the hangman. When your enemies see you as fresh meat, the only way to save yourself is to throw them something fresher. Hence, a regional war. Netanyahu needs to manufacture an emergency of such magnitude and severity that everyone will be so busy trying to put out the inferno that he started that he can slither away under cover of chaos. That's his plan. But the usual border skirmish with Lebanon that Israel's used to, that won't be enough to help Netanyahu. He needs something big, something that could get totally out of hand. When the ICJ said that they were going to investigate Israel for genocide, that automatically made it a far bigger issue than anything that Putin was doing in Ukraine. Israel's usual talking points haven't worked. And in the process, Israel has revealed to everybody that the young generation, everybody who's at least under 40, are not with them. They simply don't have enough evangelical Christians or out-of-control Zionists to prop up their little regime. This is an existential crisis that they're facing. But it's not from Gaza or the Palestinians. It's from the people in the West who they're depending on for money and weapons to prop up their little experiment out there in the desert. Now, What does this have to do with black people in America? The answer? Beyond the prospect of a regional war that the Kamala Harris White House will decide to jump into for no reason, it has nothing to do with us on either side. This isn't our fight. In fact, if the U.S. had stayed out of it, this thing would have sorted itself out decades ago. But there's something I noticed from a few otherwise well-meaning folks around here. Israel is undoubtedly a proxy army for the U.S., which means that they're basically a white supremacist adjacent element, and everything they do is for that purpose. So there's those who want to know why I'm not cheerleading for the Palestinians then. Well, because we live in a world defined by anti-black racism, and everybody wants a piece of that one. You even have a majority of so-called black people who have signed on to that devil's bargain, or who would like to. So we need to understand that under these circumstances, the enemy of your enemy isn't always your friend at all. Even if there's a consensus now that the Israelis are the aggressors in this case, the problem happens to be that if the Palestinians were not over there in the Middle East, would they be Black America's friends? The past gives us the best answer to that question. The Brits said that they would wipe out the Irish. That's something they actually said that they would do. And yet, even during the Irish potato famine, when millions of Irish emigres fled Ireland, where did they flee to? The U.S. Why? Because Black Americans had established the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. That way, when the Irish got here, they couldn't be forced into indentured servitude. They would also have the right to vote when they got here as well as run for public office, things they couldn't do at home. So after we did all the heavy lifting, and we took all the blows and the dead bodies, we did all the hard work, other people waltzed in here where they're being handed all these things on a platter. And when the Irish got to the U.S., what did they do? Well, I'll tell you what they didn't do. They did not ally themselves with us. They didn't try to make friends with the black people who had laid the path for them. Instead, they immediately closed ranks with the same British cousins who were oppressing them in Ireland. And keep in mind, while the Irish were carrying out racial massacres like the draft riots and others against black Americans in the U.S., they were still being oppressed and mistreated by the British back in Ireland at that exact same time. In fact, the Irish continued to be oppressed by the British until the 21st century. And yet, when they got to the U.S., they were every bit as racist as the Anglo-Saxons and Scots who came here before them. Nathan Forrest, the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, was of Irish descent, don't forget. America dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, the only time in human history that nuclear weapons have actually been used in war. And yet, as soon as Japan surrendered, they got on the same team with white supremacy, and those emigres who came to the U.S. couldn't wait to get on team anti-black. Same thing happened after the Korean and Vietnam Wars. So-called boat people came to the U.S. and began being racist as all get out against black people. I don't want my tax dollars going to Israel's war machine. They're supposed to be a wealthy country to begin with. They claim, anyway, that they got one of the most robust tech sectors on the planet, though many of those Israeli tech people have left the country since the latest war started. So Israel doesn't need any foreign aid, and truth be told, they haven't needed it in decades. Should the U.S. defund Israel? Absolutely. All that money that the U.S. has been sending to Israel should be going toward black cash reparations. Truth be told, all of America's foreign aid to the Middle East has been nothing more than a political and economic contagion over there. What's going on in that region is ultimately a political problem. They're going to require a political solution, not a military one. But as long as somebody else is footing the bill for the Israeli army, then the Israelis have no incentive to negotiate because they have somebody else's money and weapons to play with. And as long as Daddy Warbucks in D.C. is footing the bill, why stop fighting? Wars usually come to an end for one of 3 reasons. The first, one side or the other runs out of land and has to concede, so once your enemy takes enough of your real estate, including your capital, you have to quit. This happened to Japan. The second reason that wars typically come to an end, one side or the other runs out of men to fight their war. General Curtis LeMay masterminded the firebombing of Japan as well as the nuclear bombing of the place, and he infamously said, "War is killing people. When you kill enough of them, the other guy quits." And the third reason that wars come to an end is that one side or the other simply runs out of money. That's why the Cold War ended. The Russian economy simply ran out of gas. Of all the ways to end a war, bankrupting your opponent tends to be the least destructive. Once people can no longer depend on the bullet and the bomb to get their way, they have no choice but to sit down and negotiate. But white power is not about peace. It's about war. War is how white power took over the world, and it's how white power intends to keep it. So peace is simply not an option, no matter what they may claim publicly. And yes, I do think that more people are now seeing that the apocalyptic rhetoric that the Israelis have always traded in about Iran or any other country over there that they don't like, those claims are sounding exactly like what Benjamin Netanyahu and his ilk are doing. Out-of-control religious fanatics, hell-bent on using their army to dictate terms to as many people as possible, and of course threatening nuclear war if anyone tries to remove them from power. That doesn't sound so much like Iran as it sounds like Benjamin Netanyahu and his friends. It's like a mass shooter running around with a nuclear bomb. Let them kill everyone they want, or they'll just kill everyone. So that's my brief take on it. Family, there's tragedies all over the world, but there's no tragedy that's been categorically more ignored than ours. The Palestinians have been backed and funded and armed by numerous governments over the decades and political movements around the world. Yet here we are, in the belly of the beast, with everyone seeing our suffering, and who's been supporting us? Everyone's seen how we're being treated, and our oppression has been going on far longer than the Palestinians. You have survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre being told that they're not entitled to justice for the crimes committed against them. Well, I'd like to know where the UN delegates are who walk out on the US for that reason, or any reason at all. Nobody ever does that for us. But when Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to address the UN prior to what everyone knew was going to be a declaration of war against Lebanon, a large number of the delegates walked out in protest. A shame that they've never done that to the U.S. on our behalf. No African despot, tin-horn tyrant, or head of state, however few of those there are, would ever go disrespecting the Palestinians. And yet those guys have had the nerve to talk trash about us. You got some guys over there who claim that they're coup leaders and they're revolutionaries, but how many of them have ever reached out to us? That's what I think about the coup leaders, including the ones in Niger. Family, we are a compassionate people. And compassion has its place. However, there's a lot of fights where there's simply no good guys for us to root for. And truth be told, what are we doing getting involved in other people's fights anyway? And just for the record, what defines the difference between the good guys and the bad guys is whomever is on our side. As Black Americans, we keep trying to find these mythical non-white groups who are fighting white supremacy. People that we can sympathize with and I guess use as an avatar for ourselves. We're not armed to fight white supremacy where we are, to fight the military domination that we're under, so we're looking for proxies or people we can use as avatars for ourselves out there somewhere. Some Black Americans sympathize with the Filipinos when the U.S. invaded the Philippines at the turn of the 20th century, and reprobates like John Pershing, one of the most bloodthirsty white supremacists to ever live, was carrying out massacres there. Black Americans sympathize with the Filipinos. Some black people were so moved by their plight, they went there to help them. But the Filipinos didn't reciprocate. In fact, you have Filipino immigrants like Michelle Malkin who came to the U.S. and turned out to be one of the most blatantly anti-black racists you can name. We sympathize with the Vietnamese. Muhammad Ali lost everything because he stood in solidarity with them. He stood on principle, and he wasn't going to go over there to kill them. As Ali himself put it, no Vietnamese ever called me nigger. Well, that was because they didn't live in the U.S. at the time, but as soon as the U.S. started letting them come immigrate here, they started calling black people the N-word all the time and been doing it ever since. And the same for the Black-Brown Alliance, or as I call it, the alliance that never was. You had Africans fighting the U.S. Army in Somalia. And how did those Somalians treat us when they came to the U.S.? We keep trying to find friends, and some of us are so desperate that we begin looking at various fights around the globe, and we think that if we just root for the underdog, they will recognize our respect for them, and that will make them our friends. But it doesn't work. We are a group, and groups don't have friends. Groups have interest. Everyone else will ask for our help, then misuse and abuse our history, our struggle, and try to co-opt our moral legitimacy, and then as soon as they get what they want, they give us the middle finger. We've been through this process too many times for some of us to still not get it at this late date. Every time white power goes somewhere and starts beating up on the locals, we keep looking for these examples of non-white people fighting the white supremacists so we can cheer them on. Now, there's plenty of groups and entities out there who white power targets and attacks, but we should never conflate the temporary turf wars by these other groups with the legitimate fight for justice that we and we alone have been waging. In every case, whether we get involved or not, these underdogs that we keep wanting to root for, they always turn out fine in the end. But you know who hasn't been turning out fine at all? You and me. No matter who wins, we always seem to lose. So rather than look around the world for underdogs abroad that we can cheer for, let's focus on the underdogs who nobody has ever rooted for and who nobody is championing. Us. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. R. Laz, Gwendolyn Langston, Ginger Vine, Tyrone Leak, and Lamont Ingram. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.